In the PWHL, the standings shake up once again, and Rachel and I are going to do a deep dive into scoring in this PWHL season. That and more coming up on today's episode of the Women's Hockey Report.
This is the Women's Hockey Report presented by Locked On NHL. Your weekly look at the world of women's hockey. From the PWHL to the international stage, it's the Women's Hockey Report on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, hockey fans. Welcome to another episode of the Women's Hockey Report. Erica L. Ayala alongside Rachel Donner. We are excited to bring you everything that's going on in the PWHL. First, let's tell you that today's episode brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. We're going to talk about a lot on today's episode, Rachel, but first, let's do a vibe check.
You know, I am of two minds here because my New York Sirens, my local team, are still kind of in a tailspin, and it's stressing me out, Erica. It's really stressing me out.
I feel that. 100%. I mean, I am a native New Yorker, so there's that big Green Schroeder fan. So you hate to see them not being able to get it done. I will say, though, I have a little soft spot in my heart for Ottawa, and it looks like they're trying to get back on track. And I love what, Coach was saying is like, hey, we'll take on anyone. And I think that they need more of that attitude and mentality moving forward. We'll talk about all of the teams, but let's first talk about the shakeup once again in the standings. So many things that we have talked about throughout the season seem to be coming to fruition. And the one thing, though, that has been pretty constant is Montreal at the top, but we're going to save the Montreal Victoire talk. Let's talk about some of the other teams, including Boston, that's right now on a 4-game win streak.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they have made an incredible push. Now, the asterisk that I will put on that is 2 of those 4 wins are against the aforementioned New York Sirens, who are struggling, right?
Yeah.
So the last loss that Boston had was to Toronto, who's above them in the standings. And, speaking of Montreal, who's been dominating the league, Boston hasn't played Montreal since January 5th. So you kind of have to look at the competition. Now, does Boston have to get it done and play the games and get the wins? Yes. Have they been playing better? Also, yes. But I want to see them against some better quality competition overall before I say, yes, Boston is for real right now.
That's real. That's absolutely real. Boston sitting in that 3rd spot right now, 19 games played, and they have 30 points in the standings. As you mentioned, they are, jockeying for position against Toronto, who has 32 points right now in the standings. Minnesota falling to 4. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. But they have 29 points, 27 points for the Ottawa Charge, 22 for the New York Sirens. Again, we're going to talk about Montreal, but they sit at the top of the table here. I think some other things worth noting is Ottawa with 2 big wins, including a win against the top dog Montreal. They got that win in regulation. They also won against, as you mentioned, the New York Sirens, who have been struggling. But I thought this was interesting, especially given our next conversation. But Ottawa outshot Montreal 28-16 in that regulation win.
They did. And it was a very solid win. It wasn't like, I know the score is close, but still, like, that was a pretty dominant performance by Ottawa there. And it shows, like, when they're at their best, what they can play like, right?
Exactly. And that's the promise that we have seen or that we knew existed. That was a 3-1 win over Montreal, again, in regulation. That was a week from today. On Saturday, we had teed up that game. And then they get a 5-4 overtime win versus the New York Sirens. So I think this is an interesting team. I also like that we got to see Gwyneth Phillips in action. 15 of 16 saves for the Charge in that game. that she played. Emily Clark, 2 goals, 1 assist against Montreal. Gabby Hughes, though, was the hero, so to speak, of the game against the Sirens, also with 2 goals, 1 assist. I love when Cheyenne Darkangelo scores. I'm surprised that she hasn't scored more in the PWHL. So also just want to give some stick taps to Shy Dark, as I like to say, Cheyenne Darkangelo there. But let's talk a little bit about Montreal as we close out this first segment in recapping the games of last week, because I think some of what we're seeing with Montreal, I think, Rachel, you might have figured out the formula. And I love the number crunching that you were able to do. But again, Montreal with that win over Toronto. And you put this in our notes. That means Montreal is that team right now.
They absolutely are. So I think, obviously, Anne Renee Desbiens is a huge reason behind their success. But at the same time, they held Toronto to 1 goal
Yeah.
in that performance. And I think the other aspect of it, which is partially some of the defensive play by Montreal, which is also strong, and the goaltending. You look at for Toronto, you have Haley Scamora, Natalie Spooner, Emily Malte, Blair Turnbull. All 4 of them each had 4 shots on goal in this game and 0 goals.
Yeah.
Like, that is really hard to do, right? Like, that is 16 shots on goal turned away,
Yeah.
right? By high quality
I
players,
yeah.
right? And so that is absolutely huge. And you look at where Toronto is on the standings and how their surge has been over the last several weeks. And again, with the return of Natalie Spooner, that's been a huge part of it. For Montreal to hold them and hold those top players is a huge deal.
Massive deal. And another thing that you noted here is that, we're not showing the standings on the screen right now, but Montreal 37 points in the standings, Rachel, but only 18 games played, where coming into this weekend slate, the most games played right now, at least, is by that number 2 team, Toronto, at 21. 3 teams, Minnesota, Ottawa, and New York, have 20 games played, and the Boston Fleet with 19. So Montreal with some games in hand, because this is a balanced schedule for the PWHL. So I mean, a little bit of what we're seeing, um, them getting these points when they can, and it's something that we've talked about over the season, right? Montreal capitalizing on getting points when they could. It's paying off right now, and it's not impossible, but it does make it more difficult, at least while Montreal keeps winning or finding ways to get points, for other teams to knock them out of that number 1 spot. But maybe there's some other things that are leading to Montreal's success with regard to that. And Rachel, you crunched some numbers, so we're going to talk about that, because this is something that is wild and also something that we've talked about. Montreal,
Yeah.
they
So
do get well balanced scoring, but their top scorers are not the top scorers in the league.
no, and you would think Marie-Philippe Poulin would be, like, at or near the top of scoring in the league just because she is that prolific a scorer and an incredible player, right? But she leads Montreal in points right now, but she's 8th in the league. She's not even top 5, right? Their second highest point getter right now is Jennifer Gardner, and also phenomenal player, love watching her play. She's 18th in the league right now in scoring, and so they are getting scoring from up and down the lineup. They're getting contributions, from all of their lines, and I think that when you can spread out your scoring a little bit and get the success, and they're scoring when they need to, whether a game is close, like
Yes.
that game against Toronto, like, I think that it's a big deal, and when you have a complete game like that, you can put together the scoring when you need it from pretty much anyone, and you get solid defense and goaltending, like, that's the formula right there.
Exactly. And I love what you said. It's effectively the timing of the Montreal goals. You hear it in sports, especially in hockey, all of the time. You need the right goal or the right save at the right time. And as Rachel has done some sleuthing and some number crunching here, Montreal is getting both. And we will talk about that, what that looks like with some deeper analysis coming up on today's episode of the Women's Hockey Report. This episode of the Women's Hockey Report brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss opening tip-off or you want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same game parlay. Now, the FanDuel website also does have it's growing on women's sports, which includes women's hockey. So if you look at the slate, for example, Boston at Montreal later this afternoon, you can look at odds for anytime goal scorer, first time goal scorer, and Marie-Philippe Poulin leads in all categories. However, I might take Susanna Tapani for an anytime goal scorer with how she's played for Boston. But either way, right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the MNBA and us here at the Locked On Podcast Network. All right. Thank you for joining us for another episode, Saturday morning episode of the Women's Hockey Report. Erica L. Ayala alongside Rachel Donner, who did some fantastic work for us here. And Rachel, you were able to take a look at goals for, goals against throughout the PWHL, make a little bit of augmentations and adjustments to maybe get a little bit of a clearer picture of what's happening. We're going to post these up on the screen for those listening on, or excuse me, for those watching on YouTube, for those listening on audio. We'll do our best to break this down. But Rachel, just give me your thought process first, and then we'll break down what your kind of stat visualization and analysis shows.
Right. So I was looking at scoring in the league overall, mostly because I wanted to see what was happening with Boston and Toronto recently, right? As they were kind of climbing the standings, like what is happening here? And then conversely, what is happening with Minnesota,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And so when you do that, like I wanted to separate out the shootout wins because in the league's official league stats, like a shootout goal, win counts as one goal. So I subtracted those shootout goals from the totals when I was looking at, games played and total number of goals scored. And then I calculated goals for per game and goals against per game, which isn't available on the PWHL website currently. So I was looking at that, and interestingly, as you might expect, given our prior conversation about Montreal, they have the lowest goals against per game in the league right now at 2.22 goals against per game.
Yeah.
And that kind of tracks. Now, we've talked about them being able to score when they need to, and they are the second highest goals for per game at 2.72, right? Second to, interestingly, which is what prompted the investigation, the Minnesota Frost, who have the
Yes.
highest goals for per game at 2.75. Now, so if you look at all this, like Minnesota had a lot of scoring early and
Yes.
it's like tapered off, right? Montreal has been consistent. Boston has come up recently, but they've scored against weaker teams that
Right.
they've played recently. So they've upped their average, but it's still fourth in the league, kind of where they sit approximately in the standings with
Right.
2.42. Whereas like Toronto has come up and they're in the 3 slot in both categories of goals for per game and goals against per game, which completely tracks with the standings. So it's really interesting to me how like this kind of reflects where we are in the league at this point in
Yeah.
terms of the scoring.
And another thing is, Rachel, so what we're looking at here right now on the screen, excuse me, we have goals for. We also see the games played column there as well. And so when we look at goals for, let's talk about these are the goals that these teams are scoring on average per game. So Minnesota, as you said, 2.75. The New York Sirens are at the bottom of the table with 2.30. But all of these teams are averaging less than 3 goals per
Yep.
game. How does that tally with what we're seeing in the NHL? Now, granted, more teams, of course, more games, but if we were to parse down the goals for, again, this is goals that teams are scoring, that check, in their box when it comes to the final score. What is the average right now in the National Hockey League?
Yeah, so the full range of goals for per game in the NHL has a high of 3.66 and a low of 2.51.
Mm,
So the bottom in the NHL is higher than the bottom in the PWHL
mhm,
right now. But the high for the PWHL is much lower than the NHL right now. So this is a low scoring league
mhm.
by the numbers. And it's obvious when you watch the games as well, right? It's a low scoring game. Why? Goaltending. I
Yeah,
mean, the goaltending in the PWHL, again, because it's a more compact league. So you have high end goaltenders as your number one and your number two for
right,
every team, pretty much,
right.
right? So in a bigger league where the goaltending talent is spread out like the NHL, the scoring is gonna be a little higher, just naturally. But the difference was still a little surprising.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And speaking of goaltending, you also, take a look at the save percentage here for the top goaltenders, and you did a little bit of finagling as well. So this reflects any goaltender that has 4 or more appearances in the PWHL. And what we're seeing here is Emrance Mashmeyer, and this tracks to what we've talked about on our eye test,
Yep,
Rachel. We wanted to make sure Emrance Mashmeyer got all of her flowers despite being
yep.
on an Ottawa team that in the standings is not necessarily performing well. We talked about this around the time of the rivalry series. So break this down. What are we seeing on this chart? We have the names of the goaltenders, um, and then what else are we seeing here?
So I pulled their save percentage, and then I also calculated on my own the shots against per game played for each of them.
Mhm.
And, like, again, that's not a stat that shows up on the PWHL website. I probably should have included the games played here, but, I didn't for visual compactness. But the just because there are a few with fewer games played here, but I mostly kinda lowered the threshold of what constitutes a quote unquote qualified goaltender, which is different than what the PWHL website does, just
Mhm.
simply because I wanted to include Elaine Chuli because I thought she was very important to the conversation
As you
here.
should, as you should.
But partially because if you look, Emmerin Smashmeyer, to your point, she has faced the most shots against per game than any goaltender in the league at 29.31 shots against per game. And she has a 917 save percentage, which again is not the highest. There's definitely a few goaltenders that have a higher save percentage than her, including the aforementioned Anne Renee Debian, who's phenomenal. But Anne Renee Debian only faces, I say only, but it's
Right.
less,
Less.
27.69 shots against per game. Elaine Chuli faces 29 shots against per game and is still above that 900 threshold. And, you look at this league that has such high-end talent on a scoring end, and there's only of these goaltenders, there's only 2 of them that have below a 900 save percentage,
Yeah.
despite all these shots that they're facing. And the NHL, that's not like that. There's a lot of goaltenders that are below 900,
Yeah.
right? And that's why you can see the elite talent of the goaltenders here. Now, interestingly, you look at Kristen Campbell is only facing on average 23.85 shots per game and has a 903 save percentage. So a lower save percentage, facing lower shots, but she has a better defense in front of her, right?
Right. Yeah, it's I think all of this is so interesting because then it plays into a conversation or in it can play into conversations that we have about not just offense and how they're doing, but specifically for me defense. I love defense. I hate bad defense. And I think, some of what we're seeing here, for example, Corrine Schroeder up there when it comes to the amounts of shots against per game, right? Per games played,
Right.
still with a pretty decent save percentage, and the Sirens are still losing. So what does
Yep.
that tell us as just an example? And we've kind of alluded to this before. I think it's a twofold. I think that the Sirens do need to shore up defensively. I don't think that they are an aggressive team. Just looking at that game against Ottawa, the Ottawa was so active is the word that I would use. And that's not just a, pure, I'm in my defensive zone, I'm in my offensive zone. They were active throughout. Their forecheck was really creating problems. And so in hockey, it can be hard to separate and quantify exactly what is good defense because it's tied to so many other things. But with New York, I think what we're seeing from a goaltending perspective and it not necessarily matching the trends that they have as a team overall, I think that speaks to something that the GM Pascal Daou might need to think about going into the next
Yeah.
draft and free agency period to maybe shore up not just elite level scorers, because they do have a cluster, right, of scorers who we expect to be elite, but overall, they don't have the depth or they don't rely on their players as much as Montreal does. So I just love this. I really think it's great that you broke this down. Also, Gwyneth Phillips on here, again, doesn't get a lot of shine, but um, we did this for one of the other charts. Just tell us quickly before we move on here, Rachel, what are the numbers that we're seeing on here? How do they compare to what we're seeing in the NHL?
Yeah, and that's the margins again are very tight here, and that's why like any game can swing in either direction with a lot of this. So we have the shots against per game played range here is 22 to 29.31 here in the PWHL. In the NHL, it's 24.8. So the floor is higher. The ceiling is also much higher at 32.1. So you just see this is a much tighter level of goaltending competition in the PWHL than exists in the NHL. And, as a result, PWHL goaltenders are on average facing fewer shots than
Mhm,
NHL goaltenders are
mhm.
when it comes down to it in the end. Now, like we go into shot attempts and all that, like that's a whole other ball game. But like just looking at pure shots on goal, like this is what we're looking at here.
Right. Yeah. No, I love this. I'm so grateful that you broke this down. And I want to continue having this conversation because we're marching closer, of course, to world championships and wrapping up what will be this PWHL season. So we're going to keep our finger on the pulse, do some more deep dive analysis. Thank you to Rachel's number crunching. Um, and, really try to paint a picture as we move forward and see if it matches some of our eye test. But coming up, Rachel and I are once again going to give you the upcoming games for this week before our next show. Our next show, which we will be on site for. So you can probably guess that the game of the week is definitely going to be skewed because we are planning to take over Raleigh, North Carolina, along with the PWHL. But all jokes aside and personal preferences aside, we do have some pretty good analysis and another great slate of games that will have some standings implications. We'll get into that coming up on today's episode of the Women's Hockey Report.
If you're like me, your mornings have to start with a good cup of coffee. I got tired of settling for the basic grocery store pods. It just wasn't cutting it. And that's why I turned to Trade. And let me tell you, their coffee is next level. Trade is the number one specialty coffee marketplace in the US. They bring you fresh coffee from over 50 of the country's top roasters. Their experts have taste tested thousands of coffees, curating over 450 amazing roasts. Whether you're new to coffee or know exactly what you like, they'll handpick the perfect match for you. And I found a local to me Philadelphia roaster in Reanimator that I had always wanted to try. My first bag was a game changer. It has such a smooth, rich flavor. I could actually taste the difference from my usual coffee. I am drinking it right now. And their subscription makes it so easy. No more last minute grocery store runs or settling for what's ever on the shelf. And right now, Trade is exclusively offering our listeners 40% off your first order at drinktrade.com slash locked on NHL. That's drinktrade, TRADE.com slash locked on NHL for 40% off your first order. Drinktrade.com slash locked on NHL.
All right, all right. Women's hockey fans, thanks as always for joining us on a Saturday morning. We once again saw the standings in the PWHL shakeup, Rachel. And I think there's a pretty good possibility that they will again. We talked about it. The standings are pretty close points wise. Montreal, though, is building up a pretty nice cushion. Not sure if anything over the weekend will or over the next handful of games will happen to disrupt that, but people definitely can catch up. So let's get the obvious one out of the way. Both of us
Right.
are pretty excited for the next PWHL takeover tour happening in Raleigh, North Carolina. Not only will we both be there, but also are kind of I don't know, is it our favorite? Like, the team that holds a special place in our heart, the Ottawa
Yes.
Charge, are going to be playing.
Cannot wait. And I think, the Minnesota Frost are a perfect opponent for this game in North Carolina. They need that bounce back after struggling for a little bit. Ottawa, this is their chance to maybe sneak their way into the top half of the standings here. I think it should be a really fun event. North Carolina is always fun when it comes to women's hockey.
That's right.
I have never seen hockey in person in North Carolina, so I'm very excited for
Ooh.
that aspect of the whole thing. And I sad to say I've only really driven through North Carolina. I haven't, other than my time like on the highway, I haven't really spent good quality time there. So I'm very excited to do that.
Well, I, on the other hand, went to undergrad in North Carolina. So NC Raise Up, let's go. For those OGs that have been following my women's hockey journey, I would always, whether on a podcast or calling hockey games, give some love to those North Carolina natives playing women's professional hockey. And I'm hoping that we will continue that trend. Actually, a lot of people will know her as Alyssa Gallardi. She is a scout for the Minnesota Frost and is working in the AHL as well. So she used to work with the Carolina Hurricanes and some of their development and youth programming and outreach. And so I think this is just a momentous occasion for hockey fans, but specifically women's hockey fans. You've been waiting for an event in North Carolina. Here it comes. And again, for those who've been following my journey, you knew I wasn't going to miss this one. I've taken on North Carolina as somewhat of a second home, so I'm super excited for this one. And again, I can't wait to catch up with Kendall Coyne Schofield. She told us on the show at the time, Minnesota Frost, they needed to kind of get it together, and they did. And they absolutely did. I don't know. We might need to give Kendall Coyne Schofield and Lee Steckline and the rest of the crew another opportunity to get that WOHO report bump. So we're going to be on site. We're going to be on site. But those are not the only games, or it's definitely not the only game. It's actually the last game before our next episode. But there will be so many other great games, including 3 games for Montreal. They will play Minnesota, they'll play Boston, and they'll play Toronto. Boston has Montreal and New York. And I think that, as you said, this isn't going to be a really interesting week for Minnesota, but there's also another team or another matchup, Rachel, that you have your eyes set on.
Yeah, the Montreal game at Toronto, I think, is going to be absolutely fascinating because Montreal has 3 games this week. And this is where they kind of catch up a little bit in the games played. We talked about the games in hand earlier in the episode. I think this is a perfect 3-game sequence for Montreal. First against a rising Boston, and then next against Minnesota that needs to recover a bit, like we've talked about. Then this game against Toronto, who is right below them in the standings now. And, you get that Canadian rivalry going between those 2 cities already. You get a Toronto team who this is their 1 game this week. So they are going to be rested. They're going to be motivated. And to face a Montreal team who will have already played 2 games this week, like this is a real big opportunity for Toronto. While at the same time, it's a chance for Montreal to be like, no, we are that team, like we
Yeah.
talked about earlier in the
Yeah.
episode.
I like this pick. I also love what you said about Toronto. They will be rested and it's a home matchup. So
Yeah.
who is filling up the Coliseum to see the Toronto Scepters play? I think it's going to be a rowdy crowd for all of the reasons that you just mentioned. And we will recap those games and give you our thoughts live from Raleigh, North Carolina. That is the plan, the Women's Hockey Report on the road as we head to the Triad area. It's kind of, I guess it's still kind of the Triad area. That's where I went to school. Shout out to Elon, the university, not the human being. Elon University, go Phoenix. So I'm excited to be back in North Carolina. I'm going to get me some barbecue and hush puppies, some cheer wine, all of the goodies while we take in this game. But for Rachel Donner, Erica L. Ayala here, thank you for spending your Saturday morning with us. And hey, we've got games. We've got Boston and Montreal coming up, one of the games Rachel talked about. On Tuesday, again, that Minnesota-Montreal game. And then on Friday, March 7th, a busy day in the hockey world, Ottawa and Minnesota in North Carolina. We will catch you on the next episode. Let us know in the chat, are you going to be in Raleigh? If you are, come say hi. Until then, peace out, everybody.